So, hello everyone. Um, just a couple of excerpts, a couple of quotes from the beginning of our excerpt from Charles Darwin's The Descent of Man, 1871. A little background. Darwin published in 1859 The Origin of Species, where he presented a theory of nature, a theory of biology, a general theory which did not mention human beings in particular, except in passing. And that theory was that species change. Species are not fixed in the sense that any particular species that exists now, well, it may go extinct, but it may change in the sense that it may evolve into another species, and that this is the way of nature. That's why it's called theory of evolution. The theory of evolution is just the theory of species change over time, long periods of time. The other important claim, basic claim of Darwin's theory, we call it Darwinism, was the way or the mechanism by which species change, and that's the idea of natural selection or survival of the fittest. The idea that species exist, they live, but in reproduction, novelties are introduced, what we would recognize now to be genetic mutations. And that, although the principle that like produces like is still sound, sometimes small changes are introduced, what we would recognize now to be copying mistakes in DNA. But he just generally recognizes mutations or novelties, and that sometimes those novelties are beneficial to the individuals who have them. And so, being beneficial, it enables them to survive better and to reproduce more, therefore. And that's those novelties are then handed down to their offspring. And that they gradually spread because they're beneficial in this way, spread throughout the population. And that's one little step towards species change, is these introductions of these mutations, or what we would call adaptations. And that's the accumulation of these small changes over long periods of time that eventually results in species change. And it's what I take Darwinism to be, a general theory of nature, that species change, and that they change largely due to this process of natural selection or survival of the fittest. So that was the theory that was introduced in 1859. And this book, which comes 12 years later, 1871, is the application of that theory to our species, the species human being, what he calls man in the speech of the 19th century, meaning, of course, all human beings. That it applies to us too. And that was obvious from The Origin of Species in 1859, but now he's making it explicit. And, you know, that's very still sensitive material 150, 60 years later. I mean, my goodness. So at the beginning of the book, he sets out the basic principle of the thing. He says, it seemed worthwhile to try how far the principle of evolution would throw light on some of the more complex problems in the natural history of man, the natural history of human beings. So, what sort of light is he talking about? Well, we'll get into that in the next video, I think. But just the very idea that we can look at human beings as having a natural history, that is, the human species exists now in a certain form. And the idea of evolution and natural selection is that we did not always exist in this form, that we evolved from some other species. And this is the second excerpt here. The main conclusion here arrived at, and now held by many naturalists who are well competent to form a sound judgment, is that man is descended from some less highly organized form. That is, that you and I and every other living thing have a kind of a natural history, in the sense of where do we come from Oh, well, we came from our parents, right? And their parents came from their parents, right? But as a species, where did we come from? We came from another species. Here he calls it some less highly organized form. If we go back billions of years, we come from single cell creatures, right? That evolved over a very long period of time. So it is a whole different way of looking at human beings, right? The obvious contrast here is with various creation stories, especially the creation story in Genesis, first book of the Old Testament. The idea that God created Adam and Eve out of clay or out of Adam's rib. This idea of special creation is more or less now by Darwin seen as a kind of a myth or a story. The true story of human origins is that we evolved like all other creatures from other species. And that it's pretty important to Darwin that you understand this, right? I mean, this next excerpt is pretty amazing because what he basically seemed to be saying is that if you don't want to look at the world like a child, he calls it like a savage here, and all he means is somebody who has not had access to science and sort of a rational view of nature. He says who is not content to look like a savage at the phenomena of nature as disconnected. That is somebody who doesn't have the modern scientific worldview that sees that nature works according to certain natural laws, which are exceptionless, right? Cannot any longer believe that man is the work of a separate act of creation. That is, the notion that human beings have always existed on the earth and they've always existed in this form is now just an unsupportable idea, according to Darwin. He will be forced to admit that the close resemblance of the embryo of man to that, for instance, of a dog, the construction of the skull, limbs, and whole frame on the same plan with other mammals, independent of the uses to which the parts may be put, the occasional reappearance of various structures, for instance, of several muscles, which man does not normally possess, but which are common to the quadrumana, and a crowd of analogous facts. Basically saying the evidence that we are biologically related to all other creatures, which is another implication of the theory of evolution, is that all life is related in the sense if you go back far enough, there's a common ancestor, right? We and the dog, not just the ape, but all living things have a common ancestor. Right? And these divergent paths of evolution account for our differences. But they all point to the idea that there is no separate act of creation for human beings. We are related to the rest of nature like all animals. I mean, we're related to plants, right? I mean, if you want to go back far enough, all life on Earth is related. We have a common ancestor. Sometimes that common ancestor is 4.5 billion years ago, but we're related in some way to all of living things. So the big point is at the end, he says, all point in the plainest manner to the conclusion that man, human beings, is the co-descendant with other animals of common progenitor. So pretty incredible thing to say, but it's the modern scientific view of human beings, of course. We're living things, we're organisms. We evolved like every other living thing. We were not the act of some special creation. We are part of nature, as much part of nature as any other living thing, which may in a certain way seem obvious, but in a way is just an incredibly revolutionary way of viewing the human species.